Hi, everyone. I'm Patricia Shampton, and thank you for attending the Texas X's October Lunchtime Lecture. Before we get started, I wanted to invite you to a super awesome event that we're having tonight, the Texas Fight Rally. A tradition since 1960, the Texas Fight Rally and Parade is held every year before the Texas OU game. All Longhorns are invited to watch the parade make its way down Guadalupe at 7:30 p.m. and follow us to the tower where we'll send the team off to Dallas with a pep rally. At the event, you'll hear from the Longhorn football players, coaches, see performances by UT Cheer and Palm and the Longhorn Band, and we'll have photo ops with Hook'em. Help us celebrate the best weekend in college football. You can get all the details at texasx's.org, and we'll see you there. Okay, so now on to our lecture. We're very pleased to have Dr. Elizabeth Richmond-Garza join us today, who is a distinguished teaching professor of English at UT. She holds degrees from UT Berkeley, Oxford University, and Columbia University, and has held both the Mellon and Fulbright fellowships. Her areas of expertise are Oscar Wilde, theater, the Gothic, detective stories, and literary theory. She teaches diversity and inclusion through literature and the fine arts and works actively in 8 world languages. Please help me welcome Dr. Richmond-Garza. Hi, Dr. Garza.
Hello, nice to see you all. I couldn't resist starting off with something that perhaps some of you knew, but I hope it's also a piece of innovative information for you right now as well. You were just listening to the top hit of the year 1922 in October. That March Onward song, which was very much still commemorating the First World War and its costs, was still top of the pops, still what everyone wanted to reflect upon 4 years after the official end of the war. And so I'm incredibly excited and want to begin by thanking the Texas X's for inviting me to spend some time with you, and particularly honored that you have taken your lunchtime here on a beautiful, at least in Central Texas, sunny October Thursday to think about what happened just a little over 100 years ago, and maybe some almost uncanny resonances it has with us today. So I've chosen a title which I will explain, a poignant, a lyrical, actually an anonymous one as well, Blood-Swept Lands and Seas of Red, revisiting World War I in 2022. So living in Austin in 2022, the sorts of vehicles that are increasingly covering our streets, I couldn't resist putting an image of a black Tesla, look a little bit along these lines. If I take us back to the period we'll be thinking about this afternoon, a Model T Ford, also in black and very shiny, and the fastest and most exciting new thing going in town is what you would have seen on the streets of Austin making its way down Speedway or down Congress Avenue. So what could, with such different vehicles, even if I do choose them both in black paint, what could 2022 learn from 1922 or from 1914 to 1918? I will look at some very literal connections, but I'll also look holistically at what is it about living at the beginning of the 21st century that perhaps means that the most important thing we might do is reflect on the beginning of the 20th century instead. So the title that I gave is one that was really brought to life in multiple dimensions and in actual space. 888,246 ceramic poppies were installed at the Tower of London in the fall of 2014. They were intended to commemorate, to recognize, like my little brooch here, the fact that the war had been started exactly 1 century ago. The installation, which ultimately appeared rather like this, was established in real time from the beginning of the fall, from August through to November, with the armistice signing in November in 1918, by volunteers. Each one of those poppies was hand-created by someone who wanted to reflect on war, to reflect on both what had happened and perhaps on what we hoped would never happen again. The subtitle, optimistically, we now know, of the First World War was The War to End All Wars. So I just wanted to share with you something that anyone in London in that autumn would have seen. It's a time lapse of how this sea of poppies poured out of the window of the Tower of London, the weeping window, in order to remind us in this extremely concrete and poignant way. So why 888,246 poppies? Of the fact that that is the number of casualties, fatalities that occurred in the war on the English side alone. It doesn't include Americans, Canadians, Australians. It doesn't include anybody who was fighting for an opposing power. No war has ever had such severe casualties, and that doesn't even consider the individuals who suffered the terrible injuries, particularly due to being gassed, that were characteristic of the war, especially the trench warfare. And here's the poppies spilling out into the London landscape. So I wanted to take that moment of commemoration and of recognition that an artist and their volunteer team created for us 8 years ago. There's a reason why the installation is called Blood, Sweat, Lands and Seas of Red. All the poppies were ultimately collected up by the volunteers, and they were all sold in order to help veterans and their families suffering from injuries and difficulties today. So where does this text come from? It's particularly poignant and I think apt for us to reflect on the author as well as the text. All we know about the person who wrote this poem is that we don't know their name, that they were a soldier, that they were trying to write a will that was for their family, and that they never signed that will, but they left this poem next to it. And they were from Derbyshire because of some references in the will, which happens to be where my father's family come from in the UK. So the poem, and it's about twice as long, it's just the first stanza and the last, written by someone who wasn't particularly a poet and whose name we will never know. The blood, sweat, lands and seas of red where angels dare to tread, as I put my hand to reach, as God cried a tear of pain as the angels fell, again and again, as the tears of mine fell to the ground, to sleep with the flowers of red, as any be dead. Over the clouds, to sleep forever and kiss the flower of my people gone before time, to sleep and cry no more. I put my hand up and see the land of red. This is my time to go over. I may not come back, so sleep, kiss the boys for me. This imagery of the red poppies that was created literally in London, that's through all the images of this text, has to do with an actual phenomenon that took place because of the way that mechanized artillery affected the landscape, particularly in Flanders on the Belgian, French, German borderlands. If you run heavy mechanized artillery over ground, you will churn up that ground. The effects were horrific in terms of destroying the landscape, ruining the crops, creating a kind of literal wasteland. What this young man would have seen as he, quote, went over the top, which means jumps out of the trench and faced direct gunfire from the opposing forces. But astonishingly, from early on in the war, as early as the second summer in particular, that churning up of the ground apparently is the perfect way to ensure an exquisite crop of summer poppies. So each of the summers of the war, in the midst of the atrocity, the pain, and the suffering, bright red poppies came up all over the battlefields. So this image then is about not only the, if you like, stakes of war, but very much the personal and individual, the unknown soldier, the person on the home front's experience of the war. So I want to talk about the big, but I also want to talk about the small, the public, but also about the personal. Growing up partly in Britain, you are constantly surrounded by World War I memorials in a way that actually isn't always the case in the United States. I picked just one very small and close to home example. This is the list of the war dead from the entryway into the dining hall, that's where it's often located, of my college at Oxford University. All the names of all the young men, because it was an all-male college, all the names of all the young men who gave their lives in the war. One of the things I particularly appreciate about the way it's created as a space of recollection and of remembrance at Trinity College is the fact that right next to the plaque of all the English and British who died is a list of all of those who were on the opposing side who passed, the Germans and the Austrian. Unseren Toten zum Gedenken, our dead to be remembered and to be commended to our thoughts. Like the song, which is about the pains and troubles of war with which we began, as soon as the war is over, as difficult as it was, as absolute as the conflict may have felt, there was an attempt to try to create a kind of reconciliation, or at least a commemoration. But I don't need to take you to the UK, where every street corner has some kind of extraordinary memorial. The Darrell K. Royal Texas Memorial Stadium is named very particularly, especially initially, for those who gave their lives in the First World War on the American side when the Americans joined. The soldier that stands in front is very clearly attired and presented to us as somebody from that period. And like the war memorials that at least I grew up with and I find the most impactful, it's a place that contains everyone's name, something that the Vietnam War Memorial will do later, that the British and the Americans and other of the forces involved did from the very start of the 20th century. And our space on the 40 acres is filled with things that are as ubiquitous, as often passed by as the cenotaph, which is the primary British war memorial for the First World War, right in the middle of the political district of central London. And every day on the way to my office in the English department, I walk past the Littlefield Fountain, a complex installation, as we know, with so much difficult history behind it. But as I always point out to the undergraduate students who do a course with me about the First World War, there's a reason why the figures to either side of the Texan goddess divine figure in the center, this victory figure, are dressed in the way that they are and armed with World War I military belts and guns. So that's the literal parallel one might make. And I think it's important on a day like today to take a moment to think about those who passed, those whom we lost in that war in that way. But there's more in common between their period, their time frame, and ours than only the exact events that we might recollect for 14 to 18. So their world was a conflicted one from 14 to 18, a conflicted one before 14 to 18, and a conflicted one that wasn't only about the World War. Afghanistan was one of the things that if you were living in Victorian London, because I worked primarily on European capital cities, Moscow, Vienna, Paris, and London. If you were in London reading the newspaper, every day you would have been reading about Afghanistan in the run up to the war. Quentin Woodville is one of the most admired military painters, and he does images from the imperial and colonial wars that the British Empire was engaged in the late 19th and through to the mid 20th century. Here, the saving of the guns at Maiwan, part of the series of events around the perhaps most famous charge of the Light Brigade. Reminding ourselves of the late 20th century in our own time frame, only 6 years off the Soviet occupation or attempt to occupy Afghanistan in the 1980s and then withdrawal in 1989. And then recognizing that our news feeds are filled with the same localities and the same concerns about going into places around the world, the cost to troops, and whether in fact this cause is one that we feel confident we can continue and that we're having a beneficial effect. So I couldn't resist reminding us that Afghanistan is something that anyone in 14 would have been reflecting on. And sadly, we are still in 2022 reflecting on its pain and its instability. I've only picked a few, and I chose the second two somewhat from the same region because of the events of 2022. This is the same painter, Quentin Woodville, and this is the actual charge of the Light Brigade, a particular event that takes place when a group of English light cavalry are cornered in a valley with heavy Russian guns at the top of the hills, kind of cliffs that are above it. It has a kind of heroic escape of the light cavalry from something that is a more powerful and a more threatening group. This is Crimea in 1854. This is the Crimea that we all perhaps should have paid a little bit more attention to in 2014, when parts of what is still under conflict were being annexed and invaded by Putin's forces and government. And of course, these are the Russian troops arriving in the last couple of weeks for various of the especially serious undertakings in eastern Ukraine. Precisely these kind of switching points between East-West, these global hubs that we read about and are concerned about each day, are those sorts of globalized concerns that were behind and epitomized by the First World War. And then to get very close to the First World War, one of the things, if you lived in Kiev, one of the things if you lived in Moscow as well, is you were not only contesting the First World War in this period. In the Russian context, you were dealing with the Russian Revolution, and you were simultaneously living with and working with conflicts in the civil war that was particularly localized in Ukraine. So here, Ukrainians are protesting in the summer of 1917, insisting on a need to give peace and security to Ukraine, to bring calm after this terrible civil war. And here, of course, is President Zelensky of Ukraine in a metro station under Kiev, giving a combination of press conference and also a kind of rally in the only space that was safe at that moment for him, as the streets were no longer a possible option. So at the grand level, and I stayed only with Europe, this globalized sense of networked violence and also networked potential is a very early 21st and a very early 20th century concept as well. So as I was thinking about today, I wondered, what should I talk about? I kind of gave us a timestamp here. Time traveled us back to that moment. Well, some people might say that what I should try to talk about is the Treaty of Versailles. And this is the famous documentarian painting that shows all of the individuals, including the US president right at the center, who are part of negotiating that peace. A peace that ultimately would be so severe in certain ways that it would catalyze the conditions for the war that came after, the Second World War, which in fact was the most clear and transparent indication that the First World War was not the war to end all wars any more than we have ended all wars today. But rather than talking about Versailles, I thought I might want to talk about what the experience of war would have been like for us, for those of us who were on the front, for those of us who were at home. Why was this such an uneasy period in ways that resonates with us today? So I want to talk about the uneasy home fronts. Why should we perhaps be reflecting on that period, not only the war, but also that period as a whole? Looking at that moment, and this is where my own research is located, between the late 19th century and the end of the First World War, and I only pick three things here, in addition to that international instability. The first one is to look at gender. Things are happening at the end of the 19th century as women are able to attend university in limited ways and given more opportunities that are shifting subtly the way that women and gender is being understood. One of the best ways of looking at how gender is viewed by ordinary people, not in pamphlets, not in parliamentary debates, is actually to look at the magazines that people read in the evening, and especially to look, I think, at the cartoons. The phrase that's used in the period is the new woman. And this image of two women engaging in highly suspect masculine behaviors, ones that we of course know better than to do in the 21st century, like smoking, ones that we perhaps still do in the 21st century, like wearing ties and reading lots of books. The dialogue between the two at the bottom of the cartoon of the new woman is, "You're not leaving us, Jack. Tea will be here directly," from one of the female figures at the front. And the male figure at the back, who's about to open the door, says, "Oh, I'm going for a cup of tea in the servants' hall. I can't get on without female society, you know." So in addition to the snobism and classism of the way the servants are being considered here as being effeminate and inadequate in some way, he has dedicated himself to making a claim that these two obviously female-attired female characters are no longer female. They have transformed themselves into something else that he doesn't want to be around. That phrase, the new woman, comes from an extremely popular comic play that's about these clever, educated, bespectacled women who are taking on roles that one doesn't expect to be part of the conventional separate spheres, angel of the household view of how women should behave. If the play and the cartoons are from the 19th century, By the time we get to 1914, and this photograph is from 1915, as in many military conflict situations, women are having not only to hold the home front, they're actually having to step into industrial and economic and commercial roles to keep the economy of the UK going. These three women are the workers at the munitions factory, and you may remember or resonate with some of the US images of women working in the factories. So there's a push towards a more diverse and a more inclusive view of what women might be able to do. There's comic things about it in the 19th century. There's the practicality of women taking on important, often masculine associated, even dangerous jobs during the war. And of course, the other thing that we all remember happens in 1918. The armistice is signed on November 11th, and women get the vote in December of 2018, a little bit later here in the United States. So gender is shifting in ways that, as we reflect, I'll leave you to pick the gender issues for 2022, are perhaps helpful for us to think about women being given options and access to certain things. And then, of course, there'll be something of a retrenchment, of pulling back after the end of the war that goes uneasily. The second thing I wanted us to think about in terms of both our world and their world is the question of race, and particularly in the period Darwin, migration, and eugenics. All of these are things that come into being and come to the fore in the end of the 19th century and during the First World War. So there's a particularly problematic, I would say, phrase and concept that's quite dominant in late 19th century contexts. This again is a cartoon from Punch, which is a satirical magazine primarily directed at middle-class male readers. It continues well through to the end of the 20th century. This is a famous cartoon from 1882, and the topic was in the day considered in the phrase social Darwinism. So the caption at the bottom is "Man is but a worm." It's taking the notion of Darwinian evolution, and it's applying it not only, if you follow it, you need to follow it counterclockwise from the bottom left in this kind of spiral to the top. So it's as though you're doing the clock backwards, rewinding it, and then an inside loop to it until we arrive here. From worms to worms sort of mashed up with monkeys, to monkeys that begin to walk erect, to a sort of classicized caveman image, we arrive at the center at the middle-class English male with the shiny slicked down hair, his silk hat, and his appropriate business attire. The figure at the very center, who has some sort of affinities, I think, with images maybe of Socrates, or perhaps even of God the Father, is here, of course, a portrait of Darwin himself. Figures like this one at the front are the ones that I think are particularly interesting and troubling to us nowadays. Social Darwinism held that just as species could be more or less evolved, so too human ethnicities and races could be more and less evolved. In the period, emphasis was particularly placed on racial diversity, which was understood a little bit differently then, so that Irishness was considered racial difference, Jewishness was considered racial difference, as well as colonial global identities. Quite notoriously in 1902, on the run-up to the passing in 1905 of the very strict anti-immigration policy, the UK was preoccupied with what kind of country are we? Are our borders really open in a way that we are comfortable with? England had been very receptive to allowing people to migrate. The two main populations that had been allowed in were Irish, fleeing the famine, the terrible potato famine in Ireland and starvation, and East European Jews who were fleeing difficult conditions in terms of food and other sustenance, but who were specifically being targeted by the Russian imperial pogroms. This poster that was set up all over London called people to a great public demonstration under the auspices of the British Brothers League in favor of restricting further immigration of destitute foreigners, and it gives you the time and the place to which you should present yourself to oppose immigration and diversification in England. This entire push and anxiety around race and diversity is one that was scientifically being forwarded and promulgated as well. I've given you just one image here from the extraordinary things that Sir Francis Galton, he was given a knighthood for his work, did in terms of trying to create a way of understanding racial diversity in a manner that was, if you like, objective and was not purely subjective in the way that one might imagine simple prejudice would be. So his activity was to take photographs, and then he did elaborate measurements of the photographs, to take photographs of diverse people in London And he was quite convinced that based on those photographs, he could predict whether they would be good or whether they would be dangerous citizens. So the photographs and this wonderful new apparatus of the camera are used in this manner. He will take dozens and dozens of photographs, and then what he does is he superimposes them on each other so as to create a type. Giving you just one of the sort of pages, this is all from the Imperial College in London. So the image on the top left is one that says this is 23 cases, so 23 photographs have been used, and they are 12 of them officers, 11 of them privates, and the images have been superimposed to create the type of a British military officer. Under the category of disease, by contrast with health, there are 6 images superimposed at the top, and they're all of Irish males. There are 9 images that are superimposed on the bottom. They are all of Jewish East European males, and those types of faces are being presumed to be those that are most susceptible to what was a ravaging disease at the time, tuberculosis. So you could simply look at one and determine whether they were good or bad, healthy or not healthy. Perhaps most striking of all, at the top on the third set of images on the top right, is the likelihood of someone being liable to commit criminal offenses. So in the case of the top image, again, 8 pictures, photographs were superimposed. In the case of the bottom one, 4 images were superimposed. The top image is superimposition of 8 Irish males. The bottom image is of 4 Jewish males. At the bottom, and he's actually very interested in females as well as males, is the equivalent for consumption and other maladies. Using female images, creating again the composites, we get a 56 case profile, and I'm now using the word on purpose, profile of the kind of person who's likely to be a drain on the system because they have poor health. On the bottom right, we have 100 cases and 50 cases of individuals who are not consumptive. The period is preoccupied with how to be able to understand and recognize your neighbor and who belongs, who's likely to be threatening, who's likely to be positive. I couldn't resist putting a few little things for us in consideration that are from the Harry Ransom Center. And I work on Oscar Wilde, so that's what you're seeing right up here. He's famous as one of the first people, well before any Kardashian could ever have been imagined, to have curated and worked the paparazzi and publicity to his best purposes. These are a series of photographs all taken in New York by an early and very famous sort of society photographer, Nicolas Saroni. Each one of these is just a scan from the HRC. That's my personal favorite of him, being sort of young romantic poet. And probably his most famous image is the one of him here with his cape and fedora. He bought all of these fancy outfits to come and tour in the United States, and he lectured in several locations in Texas, particularly was well received in Galveston when he gave his talk there. The late 19th and the early 20th century, like the late 20th and the early 21st century, are filled with people who are preoccupied with the living of double lives. I'm considering and continuing the conversation around race and diversity, now including not only the fact that Oscar Wilde is Irish, but also that he's homosexual. Punch will parody Oscar Wilde for being far too refined, far too aestheticist, not being the kind of man that one was comfortable with in the period. But in a newspaper article that was printed at the same time, race will actually be directly indicated here. As we wonder what kinds of images, in this case, how far is it from this, obviously some sort of a chimpanzee monkey creature with a piece of fruit in its paw, to this, Oscar Wilde, with his signature sunflower. Anxieties around identity, especially intersectional and diverse identity, were a major feature of the run-up to the war, and perhaps are at least as important to us nowadays. Oscar Wilde's eccentricity and idiosyncrasies were punished severely, as were his breaking of the Lapachère Amendment by his sensational trial in 1895, his imprisonment until 1897 after his conviction, and he died in 1900, which is why we will never know what he would have thought of the war. He should have lived to see it had he not been committed to those difficult circumstances. And Wilde anticipates something that we all do nowadays, old school social media. Wilde's career hinged upon his capacity to create what we would now call a tweet. Some of my personal favorites, being able to say something pithy that's going to go viral in Victorian or in 21st century terms. Always forgive your enemies, nothing annoys them so much. It only takes 50 characters to say something as clever and provocative as that. One of my personal favorites, true friends stab you in the front. It's only 30 characters and certainly something to think about. The only way to get rid of temptation is to yield to it. I can resist everything but temptation. That one took him a little more, 81 characters. Experience is simply the name we give our mistakes, is 44. To love oneself is the beginning of a lifelong romance, is 47. These little quips, these pithy statements, is how Oscar Wilde secured his publicity and his position in London society until it all fell apart. If you hashtag Oscar Wilde on Twitter at the moment, you'll still get some of these wonderful ones. The great thing being here that the first one, be yourself, everybody else is already taken. Oscar Wilde, I think, would have absolutely adored that, but it's fake. It's actually a modern tweet. It isn't an Oscar Wildeism at all. I also particularly appreciate at the bottom, el único deber es el deber de divertirse terriblemente y eso hice. This is a multilingual project of putting out your identity through images, as we do nowadays on Instagram, and through clever texts, as we do on Twitter. And the war is the period where some of that comes to the fore. So what would you like me to talk about right now? The reason that the DKR Stadium has that wall of those who passed in the war is because of the Zimmermann telegram. I feel like I do need to mention it because that's how the United States comes to be in the war. The US is terribly hesitant. We have these conversations today about joining a global conflict that was really about somebody else's problems, in this case, Europe's and Europe's empires. The Zimmermann telegram is the crucial piece. It's when the Germans reach out to Mexico to ask and invite Mexico to join on the German side. This, near to home, because it is a colonial and imperial and global war moment, is, and you can see the timestamp on it, is the one where the US recognizes it must take sides, that this war is not something that's over there, out of sight and out of mind. It's something that's absolutely on a long land border with the United States. So I could talk about the Zimmermann telegram, but I think I'd rather talk to you about things like this. This is from the Imperial War Museum. It's one of the handwritten notes, the kind of thing to which the poem that I used as my title and the installation in London used as their title for the talk and for thinking about the war. So I think I'm going to stay with the ordinary people who are wondering about immigration, the ordinary people who are uneasy about gender, the ordinary people who are seeing new ways of, if you like, spreading and sharing their identities with other people, and in that are quite sure how safe and how feasible that is ultimately going to be. I chose today's date, and I'm so grateful to the Axis for letting me choose it, because it's the beginning of the end of the war. The 6th of October, 1918 is when a turning point happens in the Battle of St. Quentin Canal. The battle had begun on the 29th of September, and it was a crucial one for controlling a bridge over a canal and the canal itself. That's the battlefield. And I thought it was really important, just for one moment, there's so much documentary photography of the First World War, truly to recognize the number of ordinary lives, not just generals, not just people who signed treaties, but ordinary lives that were transformed and impacted by this war. So I wanted to not read you the telegram, but read you a letter from Arthur Dease. It's one of the ones that I think is most poignant, from the 5th of June, 1915, early in the war. This ordinary soldier says, one gets rather depressed at times. We all do, about the continuance of war. We seem to make no progress, although we were told in May meetings things were to move, and now we are well on the way to June and nothing happens. Or is there any sign of anything like an advance? I fancy all the nations, bar perhaps Italy, who have only just started, are sick to death of the war already. And that's the 5th of June, 1915. But I don't want to leave you in the grim. And I'm going to actually go with an earlier piece of the war to say that. Wilde in a play talks about how hard modernity, the modern world, feels. And one of his very witty characters says, when he's accused of being gloomy, I'm not a pessimist. Indeed, I'm not quite sure what pessimism really means. All I do know is that life cannot be understood without much charity, cannot be lived without much charity. It's love and not German philosophy that is the true explanation of the world, whatever may be the explanation of the next. In another one of his essays, Oscar Wilde says something that I find I hold on to in the modern context of 2022 with all of our sufferings in Iran, in Ukraine again, and elsewhere. Under attack, individuality is intensified. We become more completely ourselves. Not that we pick attack, but attack can allow people to shine in remarkable ways. Connectedness to the world is something that has a long history in Western thought. An enslaved philosopher and critic called Diogenes, when asked with his beautiful Greek, but his slightly particularly Persian accent, "Where are you from?" answered in the 4th century BCE, not that he was Persian, not that he was Greek, but that he was a cosmopolites. He was a citizen of the world. Ghanaian West African British philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah a few years ago invited us to think about the fact that we have obligations to people who are not close to us, and we must take interest in the lives, beliefs, and practices of others. Not the people who are like us, of course we should do that. There's the ones that are not like us we need to take interest in. Harry Truman was insistent that actually this globe is connected. If we don't want to die together in war, we need to learn to live together in peace. The reason I exist is because my mother got a Fulbright fellowship as well and went to the UK and met my father at Oxford in the 1950s, right after that Second World War. I had a Fulbright and I was very grateful for that. So this is a gentleman who really changed my life in extraordinarily fundamental ways. Thinking about why students and scholars needed to travel the world, live in each other's countries, Senator Fulbright says, in the long course of history, having people who understand your thought is much greater security than another submarine. The mission statement of the Fulbright Program for Educational Exchange indicates, like the University of Texas, a primary motivation and mission being to bring a little more knowledge, a little more reason, and a little more compassion into world affairs, and thereby increase the chance that nations will learn at last to live in peace and friendship. But actually, even in the war, there was a moment when peace and friendship happened. David Attenborough, the classic British filmmaker, did a fictional documentarian sort of film about the First World War called Oh, What a Lovely War in the 1960s. And I just wanted to share what actually happened on Christmas Day. So this is from Attenborough's film.
Jim? Coco. Oh, guitar. Hey, Jack.
Let's see. 16 and
Hey.
The German and the British soldiers simply decided to step out of the trenches on Christmas Day 1914 and to have Christmas lunch together. Even in the midst of a war, these moments of connection and learning to live together are possible. So the armistice, 11 November 1918, which we will commemorate just in a few weeks from now. These no man land images like those in the Attenborough film are transformed into the celebrations on both sides that the war is over. A moment which is just so incredibly deeply cherished and also so fragile as difficulties continue. And there was a victory parade in Austin as well. That's what downtown Austin used to look like 104 years ago. It's quite extraordinary having been downtown yesterday to see how things have changed and also which beautiful buildings are still there. Wanted to finish in the United States with perhaps the most famous, and it's from Woody Allen, who's obviously a complex figure to invoke, but I can't resist using this particular clip, especially in respect to the actors, with the way that perhaps America has often especially remembered the First World War, and that's through Ernest Hemingway's of thinking about it, and the particular way that it appears in this moment from Midnight in Paris from a few years ago is in the form of thinking about the tension between war and love. So with apologies for the complex reputation and identity of Allen, but I hope in respect of wanting still to see the actors, here's the moment of a young hero in the film who's time traveling in the city of Paris this time rather than London or Austin, who's time traveling in Paris, running into one of his heroes. So the young would-be writer will meet Mr. Hemingway.
you got that thing.
Hi, Mr. Hemingway. Here, I'm gonna just jump in.
The assignment was to take the hill. There were 4 of us, 5 if you count Vicente, but he had lost his hand when a grenade went off and couldn't fight as he could when I first met him. And he was young and brave, and the hill was soggy from days of rain, and it sloped down toward a road, and there were many German soldiers on the road. And the idea was to aim for the first group, and if our aim was true, we could delay them.
Were you scared?
Of what?
Getting killed?
You'll never write well if you fear dying. Do you?
Yeah, I do. I'd say it's might be my greatest fear, actually.
Well, it's something all men before you have done, all men will do.
I know.
Have you ever made love to a truly great woman?
Actually, my fiancée is pretty sexy.
And when you make love to her, you feel true and beautiful passion, and you, for at least that moment, lose your fear of death.
No, that doesn't happen.
I believe that love that is true and real creates a respite from death. All cowardice comes from not loving or not loving well, which is the same thing. And when the man who is brave and true looks death squarely in the face, like some rhino hunters I know, or Belmonte, who's truly brave, it is because they love with sufficient passion to push death out of their minds until it returns as it does to all men. And then you must make really good love again. Think about it.
So we started with 2 cars. Now I've given you another beautiful car from the 1920s as well. Hemingway's Farewell to Arms, along with Attenborough's film a little bit later, in many ways characterized especially a rather romantic view of the First World War. And here you have a repetition of a famous passage from partial recollection on Hemingway's part of his own experience having volunteered and served in Italy. So maybe all I've been saying is make love, not war. A nice 1960s style slogan for someone who did their undergraduate degree at University of California at Berkeley. Hemingway's 3-toed cat seemed to me to be a way to try to back us out into a safe space. It was one of my goals in life a few years ago to drive all the way to Key West from Austin, Texas, and meet the polydactyl kitties who are actual descendants. So perhaps it is the women on the home front who are building the bombs that were necessary. Perhaps it is the newly arrived immigrants who are making possible the extraordinary diversity of Britain in the 20th and in the 21st century. Perhaps it's the words of a simple soldier whose name we will never know, or sometimes, as in Deese's case, we will. It's what we always want to focus on when we think about these great moments in time. Maybe it's always the cats and the ordinary people who matter. So 888,245 Britons died in the war, commemorated with poppies, which look like this. My family served both on the US side and on the UK side. They provide horses for the artillery. They fought themselves in both sides. Some, 2 of those 888,245 poppies were for relatives of mine. This is what each one of those poppies looks like. And just thank you so much for your attention. And I think we do questions at this point, if I'm not mistaken, dear Patricia.
We do. That was a wonderful lecture. We're all just, I mean, it was very nice. Thank you so much. Love the imagery. Love the quotes. We do have a question from a Texas Ex's staff member. So they say that they love the poetry and quotes. What other poets and authors or artists stand out and came to be known because of their works that reference World War I?
Oh, thank you so much for the question. I actually tried not to indulge my literary side quite so much. What I would really, really recommend to you, and it's people like Sassoon, and it's people like Graves, and it's people like A.E. Housman. There's a group called the War Poets, and actually that's the way to search for it. These are just extraordinary literary expressions. There's and they're collected as a memorial for the war itself, soon after the war. Poets who do lots of other things under the title The War Poets, with extraordinary titles, like one of them imagines himself to be a schoolboy. And in school, you would have learned Latin in the period. And so you would learn heroic and patriotic Latin texts. And so the poem is simply called Dulce et Decorum. It is sweet and beautiful. And the Latin complete quote, which of course the boy doesn't have to give because every reader would know it, is Dulce et Decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and becoming to die for one's country. And it's a reflection on the loss, which was literally described as the lost generation. So there are lovely collections of many of the poets. I think Farewell to Arms is one of the go-to texts that people often look at. I actually find the letters from people enormously impactful as well. And then there are extraordinary essays that are written by a number of people who are either exactly the generation and serve, or who are just a little bit older and don't, reflecting on that moment. The Naming of Parts is an extraordinary poem where one of the poets who does do active service thinks about the disconnect between the military practice of naming all the parts of your gun and learning how to put it together, and how organized and how still and how quiet and rational that is, and what he knows he's about to have to do with that gun in the battlefield. So the one thing I always recommend to people is the war material, the war poets especially are exquisite, but they're also kind of soul shattering at the same time. So be careful with yourself reading them because they're very, very powerful.
Thank you. We've got another question from the audience. What do you think of the Bloomsburys and their influence between the wars? Was it positive or destructive?
I feel so hesitant because, of course, they are enormously admired. Some of them are pacifists and conscientious objectors. Someone like Lytton Strachey, for example, is actually dragged into court, late Victorian writer who's just on the edge of the Bloomsbury circle, for being in breach of the law, for refusing to serve militarily. So depending on your views about pacifism and conscientious objectors, many of them fall into that category. Some of the more famous ones, like Virginia Woolf, obviously there isn't a possibility for women serving directly, only in auxiliary roles. That being said, one of the difficult elements about Bloomsbury, particularly I would say about Ezra Pound, the American poet, even more so than some of the English Bloomsbury writers, is that they do seem to have been ambivalent in the 20s and 30s in relationship to fascism. And Ezra Pound is an open supporter of Mussolini and writes in favor, transparently, of Mussolini throughout the 1930s. So I think, as extraordinary as their artistic achievements are, there is some real uncomfort that one has looking at the politics. Whether one looks at the pacifists, which I think fall into a different category, or whether one looks in the direction of a sympathy with some of these strong men on the continent. So I don't want to be the predictor of difficult things by any means, but where we are right now globally with strong men, in particular, I use the word man here on purpose, with strong men in the world, for someone who works on the teams, as I do in my research, is not a terribly reassuring sign.
Can you recommend a book or two that give a holistic perspective, maybe, of World War I for some of our younger audiences? They might be seeking that info out.
Oh, thank you so much for that question. I think to this day, Paul Fussell really is the person who one goes to who writes about the Great War, and his piece, I'm going to try to make sure that I get the title of the text exactly correct for him so that you can look it up properly. And it's called, and this is the one to use also for the social history side, which is kind of what I was doing. It's simply called The Great War and Modern Memory. So there are many, many just beautiful books. And this is an old one. It's about 50 years old. But Fussell is from that generation of historians, social historians, who became committed and inspired, I think, the work that many have done, such as myself, for the last 50 years, of caring about what people actually experience, not just what's happening in Parliament, not just what's happening between diplomats or in a high-ranking officers meeting, but what's it like in the world. And what's striking about Fussell is the threads that he draws between the experience of the war and his own times of the 1970s. And then he has that fine-grained capacity to find all the original documents So if you're a fan of like Ken Burns' approach to history, I would say Paul Fussell's one of the people who really inspires that idea that, for example, if you're doing the Civil War, the First World War, you want to go deep, deep, deep into the daily lived lives of the people who had to experience it, not only do the high level kind of conversation. So that's the one I would invite everyone to start with.
Okay. We also just have a couple of comments in the QA, mainly thank you for this lecture. It's wonderful. People are raving about it. One person is actually going to Verdun and Mouzargon next week and would take your thoughts with them when they go and ponder what happened. So that's great. We also have someone else who's just, he said he enjoyed the differing perspectives of other connections, which tie the people and events together. This lecture is nice to add to the already prevalent point of views of the Great War, such as the politics, the elite families, the fighting, and of course, some of the things that you brought up with what was happening with art at the time as well. I want to go back to something that you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation, was just, you know, the memories that the Poppy event evoked in all of across the world, really. Such a big effort to put all of that together. Can you tell us about how, maybe some nuggets about how that came together? Was there an organization that really developed this idea? Did they call for volunteers from all across Great Britain? How did that work?
So thank you so much for asking about this just extraordinary collective effort. It literally involved thousands and thousands of people. It was designed by two English sort of environmental artists. They're always trying to do displays that are like integrated into what is already existing there. So they made a point of choosing the Tower of London, which was a space of punishment and a space of pain, but also extremely strategically located in central London and has that amazing lawn on the embankment that was perfect for the installation. So their names were Paul Cummins and Tom Piper. And what I think is really striking about it, so it started on the 17th of July, so it tracked exactly with the breakout of the war in the summer of 1914, and it ran through until it was fully installed on the 11th of November to mark the armistice, and it was completed. A general call was put out to everybody. You just had to want to do it. And you could sign up for any part of the process. You could sign up to help bring materials to the studios where the poppies were made. You could sign up to make the poppies, and you would be trained on how to make them. They're all just simple ceramic. They're actually extremely fragile and ephemeral. They respond very poorly to frost, as you might, they're just earthenware. So the materials were all donated, and the cost of the materials was donated. The labor of making them was donated. The close-up here, I'm glad I left it up because you can see it's literally, it's an iron stick. Mm-hmm. At the top of it is a washer. And then there's two sets of poppies, one inside each other. And then there's another washer on top of it. That's what each of the poppies is. So it was a real desire to replicate the variety and the number of people who passed, because obviously some very famous and very elite people died in that 888,245, but also to recognize everybody through the simplicity of what they had in common. Maybe one of the things that surprised me the most, it's obviously a very eloquent memorial, and it's one that's about human movement and about human activity. It's not a master artist creating a great work. It's a group of thousands of people making something take place. It took over time, obviously July to November. It was very slow. Every day they go out and put more poppies in a very systematic way. What I think was striking about it especially is that it really did not get much in the way of criticism. I think it's quite rare that public commemorations, one might think of all of the activities in a UK context around the death of the Queen recently. Although people mourn the death of any older person, there's sufficient controversies, but it's a complex conversation that the UK has had in the time after her passing. The simplicity of this memorial, which didn't take a stance on whether war is just or whether war is to be avoided, but simply said, we want to recognize those who died, was quite universally well received. And that's not so common. Maybe it's not so common in the US as well, but in the UK, most public displays are ultimately uncomfortable or unacceptable for some people. And this one really drew people together in a quite distinctive sort of way. So I don't know if there are particular things additionally. And then, as I said, they took each one of the poppies and they sold them for £35, with 100% of the profits going to wounded veterans and to the families of wounded veterans and of veterans killed in the line of duty.
Thank you for that. I just wasn't sure that all of our audience was aware of the details in the background, and it just literally how much work and effort went into that. You had touched on gender a little bit in your lecture, and one of the questions we've got is, what sort of permanent changes happened for women after the First World War? So just everyday changes, things that impacted their lives.
I think one cannot underestimate how important what happened in 1418 was. So there was a conversation, the New Woman conversation, very controversial, very heated debates. Winston Churchill was vehemently opposed to women voting, vehemently opposed to any assignation of additional human rights to women in the UK. So it was passionate debate. But the necessities of war exactly coincided with a substantial push in things like the suffragette movement to secure women the vote. And as a result, women who had begun to take on certain sorts of roles, often one of the roles, we can think about 2022 here as well, that they began to take on was the role of being a secretary, of working in an office and being the person who manages texts. In the case of the war, they actually stepped into almost every home front duty possible, including assembling airplanes as well as bombs, all the very concrete, just shy of being actively in duty. There had been substantial moves in terms of women's activities because of the advances in nursing that happened in the Crimean War. The most famous person is Florence Nightingale, but she was not the only one. So I mentioned just those in passing to say, at this point, especially 14 to 18, women didn't just secure the vote, they secured skills. A handful of women's colleges existed prior to this period. A number of women's colleges, it was still gender segregated, opened in this period. Access to education, Virginia Woolf, for example, couldn't go to university. She was homeschooled. All her brothers did go to university. She writes about that somewhat poignantly. This is a period when not only are technical rights, the authority to divorce someone for having abused you physically, the authority to own property and to inherit property as a regular course if you're female, the capacity to take a job outside of a family household, all of those things are taking place in addition to the right to vote. And this becomes controversial in other decades later. I would say particularly in the 1950s, when there's a desire to return to a more conventional sense of what gender roles might be.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Richmond-Garza, for being with us today. We really, really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. We do appreciate it.
I'm just so honored. Thank you for the warm welcome. And I'm so glad if some of this was of interest to you. I'm obviously a little bit passionate about us not forgetting these sorts of things.
Your passion is evident and we appreciate it. We do. And thank you to everyone who participated in this month's event. We appreciate you as well. And we'll be back in person at the Alumni Center for our November lecture on Tuesday, November 1st. Dr. Juan Dominguez from the Department of Psychology will be exploring the question, do hormones affect our response to addictive drugs? So you can register now at texasexes.org/lunchtime lectures. And of course, we wish you all a wonderful week and we'll see you again.